next slide.
Our next and last speaker for today will continue to bring us in the world of the web and has a very interesting question about CSS.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is going to be the usual problem solution story. In a way, I'll talk about layout designing with CSS, structure ideas from web and how they can be used for print, and how XSL and XPath might be part of a solution. I'm aware that this is an XML conference, and in the preparation of this talk, I thought that I may be digressing from the main topic here a little bit. But on the other hand, CSS is made to style XML documents, and I also promise to come back to XSL. My name is Rudolf. I work as a style sheet developer for Docufy for about 7 years now. We and I use SCSS and XSL for our layout configuration tool, Docufy Layouter, where users without CSS knowledge can configure a layout. Docufy develops software for technical documentations, among other things. And we publish user manuals from our custom XML files that users write in our content management software, Cosima. And we transform it into our in-house exchange format, which we call Docufy XML or DY-XML. And this is also the input format for the Docufy Layouter. And in this context, it is sufficient to say that DY-XML is a restricted XHTML format, which is split up into some topic files that are referenced by a main file. So the content is basically HTML. And since XSLF is no longer developed, and Antenna House has a CSS formatter for many years now, we just need to add some CSS. But we also needed XSL from the start, because we had to produce one resolved XML file to generate PDF. And we also needed to add directories, chapter numbers, page area content, and so on. So Docufy Layouter in the end was only, in the beginning, was only able to publish PDF files. But over the years, we added 2 more HTML formats, one for our content delivery platform Topic Pilot, and the other one for a standalone HTML package. And thanks to CSS, this was comparatively easy. So just to show you what Layouter is about, we can configure different layouts, cover pages, multi-column layout, right-to-left layouts, responsive HTML. I can go on with thumb indexes, edge indexes, multilingual documents, and so on and so forth. But for this talk and for the issue here, I want to stick to safety and warning notices. They became highly configurable over the years because they're an important part of the documentation for technical writers. In DY-XML, they consist of a signal word panel with a signal word and a safety alert symbol, a symbol panel for specific hazards, and of course the message itself. As the images are part of the safety standard, they are part of the DY-XML and not of the layout. So for our first design, we copied our old XSLFO design, and we want to make it look like this. So nowadays, and with CSS, you could use, for example, grid to get this result. So for our initial projects, selectors were more or less like simple. They consisted of one attribute and maybe one element. So this leads to specificity for 10 or 11. So the 10th digit is the attribute and the 1st digit is the element. But as you can also see here, there are other risk levels and safety standards, and the hazard symbols might be optional. But so far, CSS is still somewhat organized, and as I said, we use SCSS, which is a precompile language that provides logical structures, mix and selector nesting, and so on, which helps us organize the CSS. But as you can imagine, we did not stick to one layout. Next, we implemented the ANSI safety standard. On the same XML construct, it only differs in one attribute value. We added a more compact design for multi-column layout to save space. We also added some configurations like colors, borders, fonts, and such. But as safety standards are, or the standard does not define an actual visualization, and they are a sensible part of the manuals, customers tend to have numerous requirements for it. So this led to something we called arrangement variants, which is basically layout configuration, which we implemented with SCSS and some extra wrappers that we generated with XSL to just add some more positioning variants, also for ANSI, but it's a little bit more restricted there. Then there was some requirement that's called safety chapter. So it's a first chapter in a document that explains general hazards, and the safety notices there should be more reduced. So for ISO, we just skipped the background color. And for ANSI, it is more restricted, so we needed an extra arrangement variant there that's called embedded. And it also should be used within instructions. Then the next thing we added is right-to-left layout, for example, in Arabic. And we also have our HTML formats, so we needed some compact design for responsive layout as well. And in addition to all the visual stuff, there might also be some technical differences per consumer. For example, Antenna House only supported the grid layout recently, so all the arrangement variants for PDF had to be implemented with table layouts and floats. So what happens when we just look at, for example, the signal word panel? Selectors are multiplying by a lot. And we might also have some additional selectors for specific media queries. And they all refer to, for example, wrappers, RTL attributes, and different variants that are expressed by different attribute values. So we still have SCSS, which helps us organize the selectors, but all those selectors become more specific, which makes them also less predictable. And they may conflict with any additional requirement, and the specificity is increasing even much more. So what the problem is here is that specificity is implicit for CSS selectors. And at some point, they become barely scalable, and there's nothing like granular precedence as in XSL. So when we look at it from the perspective of the cascade, our current problem lies with specificity and order. And we have other parts of the cascade, for example, the importance, the shadow context, and the inline styles, but they are no sustainable alternative or are simply just not possible in the environment. Browsers started to support layouts for, I think 2 years before. It's a nice feature, but it does not really help us with our problem. But it's nice to keep it in mind, though. So what can we do? Well, CSS originates from the web, so despite the differences between web and print, it is both user-driven and it is both CSS. So web CSS faced the question of large projects much earlier as it developed with the web. So let's take a look here. I put together some overview of developments that I found interesting for myself, but it's not a complete overview. Before anything else, of course, it started with good practices, like, for example, keep selectors as general as possible, be consistent, split up files, comment your code if you do anything fancy. But as the web evolved, there seems to be the necessity for more structure. So in 2008, Nicole Sullivan introduced her idea of object-oriented CSS. She talked about reusable visual patterns, about how structure should be separated from what she called the skin. but she focused more on the concept and on the actual realization. But based on her ideas, Yandex published a naming methodology, BEM, that stands for Block Element Modifier, which offers a more concrete idea to keep specificity lower by adding one class per what you may call a pattern, and maybe one additional class for some modification of it. From 2011, it started with some architectural ideas. The first one was SMACSS, which stands for Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS. It sorts CSS rules into some types, but those types are strongly inspired by the structure of websites, which makes them hard to adapt for print, really. And they do not offer a concrete concept for specificity. But parallel to this, there were some other developments, you might call them. Examples are Atomic CSS or CSS in JS. They abandon the specificity altogether by just adding one class per declaration, which means one property and explicit value. So to work with that, you really need a framework, and because with Layouter, the users can choose the values, it's simply not possible to implement it like that. So something like 10 years back, Harry Roberts introduced his idea of inverted triangle CSS. He proposed some very abstract levels which seemed promising for print or cross-media. And the levels or layers were also kind of linked to a specific, to a CSS specificity range, so to say. So let's have a deeper look into this. ITCSS, the basic concept are three axes. It's the reach, the specificity, and the explicitness, and they form a triangle which includes 7 levels or layers. It also, which is very nice, it also considers SCSS, maybe because it became more prominent in the CSS community over the years. But if you read about this ITCSS, there are different versions of it, depending on whether CSS or SCSS is included. So I picked the version that was most useful for me. So the first level is about global SCSS variables. Then next comes some functions and mix-ins. The third level is the first level that actually results in CSS. It may include some wildcard selectors or general add rules, also, for example, the add page rule. Then the next level are the basic HTML element rules. And if you need, I read different things about it, but if you need, you can also implement the object level. Some talk about it as general layouts, for example, like grid or flex, which you use over and over again. Some also say it should be like small repeating parts of a layout. It really depends on the use case, I think. So the next level is about components, which is the reusable visual patterns, like, for example, a sidebar, or in means of print, it could also be a directory entry or a page header. And the last level are utilities or trumps, which are very specific rules to override all the preceding rules if needed. And the nice thing is that components and objects include the naming methodology BEM. So when you look at it, for example, you take the directory entry, it consists of the elements enumeration, label, leader, and page number, and it might have a modifier, for example, table of content level 1. So this is nice because it keeps the specificity very low, and even though you have a lot of styling. But all the web concepts assume that the layout comes first and that the content is added. The layout may even decide what content is displayed, but this is not how manuals or publications are working. Here, the content is usually first, and most of the layout adapts to it. So you don't want to have a table of content in a publication which only consists of one chapter. So let's take a step back and let's think about it from the start. We have DY.XML, and we want all those beautiful safety notices on the same XML construct. We may give them even names. We may call them hint, ISO, normal, maybe with a variant reduced and danger, hint, ANSI, normal, or embedded. Maybe with the descendants, hint, ANSI, normal panel, with the variant of color danger, and so on and so forth. Whatever we can define for the looks. So on a more abstract level, we have the semantics on one hand, like the danger safety notice, and we want to get to some visual patterns, maybe also to some variants, if necessary. And with this separation, like semantics and looks, the styling is scalable again. So what we need, of course, we also given them some nice names. What we need is some kind of mapping or linking in between. And this linking should depend on an XML context. It should also depend on layout configurations and on the output type. So you might have guessed it already, but what better to use than XSL, since it's already there. And it really leads to a classic XSL template, which adds, for example, class values, but could also add any other attributes that are useful for your linking. And it could also, of course, add additional elements. Linking everything, of course, takes effort, but it plays on the strength on both CSS and XPath, because XPath is there for selecting elements. It is also more granular than CSS selectors, and it can take the following axes into account. And CSS is left only with specificity and styling. So when you look at the long CSS selectors from the start, they become predictable again and have a limited number of variants with a low specificity. Some selectors might even be obsolete because they were only there to override other selectors in some kind of specificity war. But you may also notice that we kept the direction attribute at the ancestor, because this is actually generated by an SCSS mixed-int and is consistent over the whole style sheet, which also makes it predictable. So looking back at how requirements increased, with Docufile Layout, we started with about 100 layout configuration and one output. Nowadays, we have kind of more than 1,000 layout configurations and 3 outputs. And some configurations are more complex than others, and it is a still growing project. So for safety notices, they started as something that could easily be selected with selectors. At the next stage, so to say, they will still be selectable, but tend to be more specific. What is important to notice is that visual patterns existed from the start, but because one visual pattern was one semantic element, it was less obvious. So the next stage, by adding attributes, this is the only way to select the element, because CSS selectors are no longer enough. And on the last part, even that becomes hard to maintain, because what's actually happening is that visual patterns are increasing, even if you don't link them, they're just there. And other semantic constructs might be, of the same project, might be in different stages, like, for example, tables might have different attributes, but they are already there and can still be selected. Or inline elements are usually less complex, so they can easily be selected. And you just have to believe me on this one. Figures with legends have additional elements and also additional attributes for all the positioning we're doing with it. So for a certain size, pure CSS solution is really possible, and SCSS can aid with that. Maybe if you want, you can even add cascade layers with ITCSS if it helps your structure. But as soon as selectors become more specific, XPath offers more possibilities and help to keep CSS simple. So what's the moral of this story? Adding some CSS isn't enough for large and growing projects because with complex requirements, selectors display XML semantics. And the higher the specificity, the less scalable it all becomes. So XPath, if it's possible in the environment, can handle selection of elements much better, and by adding an attribute to link between semantics and styling, it is really good to read as well. And it can also be like any attribute. So the remaining challenge, I think, is left is a comprehensible labeling of all the visual patterns. Maybe also the choice of the notation. For example, BEM provides some double minus to visualize the modifier. What it also might conflict with XML comments here. I'm open for suggestions if you have any. And what is untouched by all the structure approach is the challenge of the cross-media support for CSS features. And maybe one final thought, why did we not think about this from the start? There were more requirements than initially expected, like the usual stuff. We had little experience with large SCSS or CSS projects. And most of all, and maybe on a more philosophical level, we thought more in semantic categories rather than in visual ones and did not consciously differentiate between those two. That's about it. If you're interested in the topic, you can look up some of my sources. And thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very, very interesting. Any question? Oh, yes.
Welcome to Semantic Theming. As the one who actually been doing similar stuff, I really kind of understand the challenges you faced. But from the other side, I see that you have a lot of advantages through the going as a XSLT as a part of the process. Have you met the academic publishing on the subject of semantic theming?
I don't think so.
Have you done research on that?
Probably not.
Okay, thank you.
All the people asking questions that are above, please raise your hand so yeah, can make some sports.
Thank you for the presentation. I didn't quite get what exactly the XSLT did, but what I understood is that it actually increases specificity. Is that a good understanding, or am I mistaken?
The XSL is like the linking between the CSS and the element by adding a class. So I'm not sure whether I get your question.
Well, I thought the effect of that is to increase specificity.
Not to increase it, to lower it. The CSS specificity.
Yes. Okay. I would have to read the paper, I think.
Yes. Is there any question? But I've been pleased to see the contains token function being used, because it has been added like 10 years ago into the XPath language, especially to support selection of classes in HTML.
Yes, it was supposed to do. No question? Okay. Thank you very much then.
Thanks.